All right. I believe it was with some shrewd advice from National Pharmaceutical Council that we located this last issue last. Much like the contextual issues and even the others, it all intersects. So there's no way to disassociate our considerations around what's orphan, what's ultra-orphan, how do we think about different qualities of clinical effectiveness information, what about the other benefits, and broader ethical and contextual considerations we would want to weave in. To a certain extent, a key part of that, and where for some people the rubber will meet the road, is when we try to figure out how the assessment of cost effectiveness, price, and affordability all somehow fit together. And again, ICER has an approach to its value framework where I think we do cost effectiveness as one component of our value framework. We have a threshold, a range between $100,000 to $150,000 per added quality adjusted life year as a main way to help decision makers think about cost effectiveness as a spectrum. And we also use that to reflect back on what a value-based price benchmark range would be. We also do an analysis on what we call potential budget impact, and our methods on that have changed over the past couple years. But really what we're going to be doing going forward is to continue with an approach where we kind of have a graph that people can play with, and it has price on one side and the percent uptake among an eligible population. And you can kind of see how different combinations of price and numbers of patients ultimately would lead to a budget impact. The goal being to at least address the potential tension between services that might reflect a really good long-term value and yet would potentially create significant strain to the budgets of health systems in the short term, so that more proactive discussion around how to manage that tension can happen in order to improve patient access to high-value care over the long haul. So that's our usual approach. Now, we've already talked about, to some extent, how cost effectiveness may or may not be the right tool to use to look at the value of rare and particularly ultra-rare conditions. We've touched on budget impact and, to a certain extent, profit as a part of the contextual consideration, at least. So we have a panel up now that I'll introduce in a sec, and we're going to start to wrestle again with some of these key features with, again, hopefully part of the goal being help give us advice and others more broadly on how we should use these tools of value assessment for rare/ultra-rare. What works, what different modulations, what have we learned from the international experience? We may bring that again, obviously, into the conversation. What seems to have worked well overseas and what hasn't. And then we'll segue from the end of this panel to the last hour, where we'll actually kind of go back, in a sense, through the different issues and try to get as concrete as we can about guiding principles. What have we learned? What kinds of signposts? What, again, real landmines do you want ICER and others to be aware of? But if we can frame it as kind of principles or action statements, I think that would be a great way to leave the day. So with that, our panel is Rick Chapman, who's the Director of Health Economics. You've already seen him introduce part of the background paper. Pat Gleason, who's the Senior Director of Health Outcomes at Prime Therapeutics. Actually, almost all of these have introduced themselves already this morning. Kenneth Hobby, who's the President of Cure SMA. David Mitchell, the President and Founder of Patients for Affordable Drugs. One person you haven't met yet is Lisa Prosser, who is a professor and the Director of Child Health Evaluation and Research. I thought ICER had the best acronym, but CHEER is pretty good. That's pretty good. At the University of Michigan. And actually ICER's very first health economist back in the day. And Matt Rauskop, who's the Senior Director for Healthcare Delivery and Payment Innovation at GlaxoSmithKline. All right, I could probably frame this question for a lot of you, but before we get too deep into an area so that it's hard to kind of circle back, Lisa, we've talked a little bit about some of what's distinct about rare, ultra-rare considerations around clinical effectiveness. Rick, as you saw, I think, presented some information on some of the challenges with modeling. So, in particular, if we're thinking about trying to model pediatric conditions, which is where a lot of your expertise lies, what are some of the best practices, and still where do you feel like cost effectiveness as a tool may need to be in some way adapted to do a good job in looking at rare conditions? I'm thinking in particular of a couple things. One is, how do we judge the quality of life effects of an intervention on children over a lifetime? And are there other things that we need to question our own approach to using cost effectiveness? And I guess, again, rarity in childhood disease doesn't always exactly overlap, especially in the current environment where there are more and more rare diseases as subsets of cancers, et cetera. But from your work on pediatric kind of cost effectiveness, what do you think are some of the key kind of lessons or warnings you would have for us?
Well, thanks, Steve, and thanks for the opportunity to be on this panel today, because this is a topic that I think we're still at the forefront of trying to define new methods for valuing children's quality of life. And as I've been listening to the conversation throughout the day, as somebody who performs cost-effectiveness analysis, and specifically in the area of children's health interventions, I think about the characteristics or the contextual factors in terms of whether or not they could enter into the cost-effectiveness framework. And so in terms of what they could enter into the cost-effectiveness framework, there are clear preferences that we know from studies of quality-adjusted life years, health utility weights, that people value children's health differently than adult health. And in fact, so just in terms of summarizing the different factors, I think that valuation of qualities by age is one area that could enter the cost-effectiveness ratio directly, but we don't necessarily have the tools to do so yet. That when we have asked, when we've performed surveys where we've asked people to value specific health states, say an episode of influenza or an influenza-related hospitalization, and the health state description is completely identical except for the age of the patient, we see very different values, both in terms of time trade-off values to value quality-adjusted life years, also in terms of willingness to pay, very consistent. And what we see is kind of a hockey stick, so that we see the highest values placed, so the largest loss in quality of life for the very youngest patients. But we also see this uptick at the other age of the age spectrum for the elderly. And so that brings us to another consideration that has also come up consistently during the conversation today, which is around caregiver and family effects. And in fact, I would define those more broadly as family effects, because when we see those different valuations for the age of the patient, it's an open question as to whether we can disentangle from those values if that's incorporating some of the family spillover effect. We believe that there are separable effects there. We don't have good tools yet as to how to measure those, that there's an effective age, that people feel differently about saving the life of a child compared to individuals of other ages, or averting any types of illnesses. There are a number of studies that have looked at saving or averting illness in the same exact health condition, but for different ages. So we know that that's one effect. But then there is also this caregiver and family effect that we've heard very compelling stories earlier and experiences from earlier in the day. And I'll just make a couple of comments on caregiver and family effects, and then I'll stop there. But I think that this is another area where very clearly, these effects could enter the cost-effectiveness calculation, but we don't have good tools to measure them. And there are a number of different family effects that measure different types of family burden that could be captured within the cost-effectiveness ratio. And a quick comment on perspective, that this is also going to differ by country, that some countries use a much narrower payer perspective, and so many of these caregiver or family effects would not be considered part of the cost-effectiveness valuation, whereas here in the United States or other places that are using a societal or broader perspective, these would enter. So just listing some of those. So there are the out-of-pocket costs that we've heard about earlier that can be quite substantial. You referred to those in your opening talk. There's caregiver time, so informal caregiver time that can be costed and valued and included in the economic evaluation. There's effects on caregiver quality of life, and there are many effects beyond just the primary caregiver, that in some studies that we've done recently, evaluating the quality of life changes for family members who have a chronically ill patient in the family, that there are clearly two effects. There's an effect on the caregiver, but there are also clear quality of life impacts on other family members. These are measurable. They can be just as high as in the primary caregiver and can be included in the cost effectiveness ratio. And I just want to close by responding to a comment that you made earlier around whether it's fair or not fair to include these in the cost effectiveness ratio when we're comparing them to other interventions, because I don't think it's a question of fair, that when we're doing cost effectiveness analyses, we make judgment calls all the time about what's in or out of the cost effectiveness ratio, and that depends on the analyst's a priori estimate of how large those effects are. And what's really important is to be transparent about whether or not those effects were included in the analysis. And so I think one approach that has come up earlier today is that if a new framework were developed, that these are effects, both the effect of age as well as caregiver and family effects that could be included. We don't have the tools yet, but there could be a framework designed for assessing those in a transparent way that could then be done consistently and systematically and compared across different interventions.
Thanks. And I know just a quick comment back is the family effects, I was saying this to somebody else, and you can imagine this, there probably is nothing, I shouldn't say there's nothing specific about rarity, but there are prevalent conditions that also have obviously very important effects on caregivers and families more broadly. They may be different in magnitude or somewhat in nature, but some of the things you're talking about are things we've also wrestled with when we hear about the effects on a family of an adolescent even with bad psoriasis, or not even life-threatening conditions can have, when severe, these conditions can have a lot of impacts on the family as well. All right, thank you for those comments, that's great. So I also just want to throw out some of the other questions that we hope to address in this session and then get you guys to kind of pick off the ones that you want to comment on first. But these are the things we're kind of all wrestling with together here. So first of all, it actually goes back to David's question in a sense. Are development and manufacturing costs relevant to pricing and the assessment of value in some way? What is the role of cost effectiveness using thresholds? Again, we've heard that in some countries, at least when they get down to a certain size, that old Newtonian versus quantum mechanics thing, when you get down to a certain size, certain things don't work. So some countries decide not to even try cost effectiveness, but just to look at budget impact and some other factors, whereas others do include cost effectiveness and raise the threshold that they use for kind of certain decisions. And then the question also, and this kind of, again, whether it relates directly to rarity or not, but what about the affordability piece? Is there a different affordability? How do we think about affordability for rare conditions? Is it linked back to what, in a sense, society is willing to pay? Is it linked back to, to what? If to the amounts of revenue that the company needs to make, again, on a certain patient basis? How do we start to think about affordability, not just how to measure it, but in what context would we put it? Should we, what's too much? How do we help decision makers grapple with what affordability means? And again, I'll just highlight here that, for some people this, would be surprising that if you take a drug that costs, $45,000 and you treat an orphan population of 100,000 patients, you stand to make $4.5 billion per year. So how do we think about affordability? Does it link back to ideas of how much needs to be funneled back into research for new drugs to keep the pipeline going? So there are different ways to think about affordability, but we'd like your guidance on how, if at all, it should shift when we think about rare or ultra-rare conditions. All right, so a large playing field here. Matt, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts?
Well, thank you, Steve. So first of all, I brought my pad and pen so I could write down all the questions while you're asking them. So if I miss any, let me know, and we'll kind of drive to that. I think many of us have talked about the value that ICER has brought, right? I mean, the idea that where ICER has gone is it has allowed many of us from payers, from manufacturers and innovators, and patient advocacy groups actually start having conversations a little bit earlier, right? The idea has always been not that there's a right answer. It's not that a report itself is the answer, but what it is, it's a starting point for a conversation. And I think in large part, that's what the value that ICER has brought. It's allowed conversations to kind of be preempt. I think it also has allowed for awareness by many of us to say, look, there are these barriers of communication that for a long time, all of us have said, that's just the way it is, and we'll just have to live with it. I think it's also brought a lot of us to try to say, how do we want to go ahead and change that? So that's the starting point. So if we want to really start saying, what is this conversation that we think the ICER report needs to have? It's really centered around, again, what is the perspective of the report? And so a lot of the reports that we'll look at with cost effectiveness, et cetera, it's the payer perspective. Right? And the idea behind that, for those who haven't played, and it's been many, many years since I've played in cost effectiveness modeling, but the idea behind this is really to start saying the indirect costs, or these costs, or these additional burdens that are outside that many of us know are related to diseases, that's not necessarily going to, we shouldn't consider that, right? That's just not where a good place to start. But we're going to do more about direct costs. What's the cost of a medicine? What's the cost for offsetting interventions? And so in large part, if we start saying that is our modeling as the very beginning, I think where we need to also land on is this notion of rare disease. We started off with, and trust me, I'll get there, Steve. It's a rambling.
You're good.
But I got to lay the groundwork. Where we really want to make sure that we get to is to say that rare disease is limitation of data. But we always talked about the clinical trial. But let's also think about some of the other areas. For us doing cost effectiveness, we really would like to go to claims data. We can go to there, claims data, insurance data, because that allows us to understand the cost. How do patients go through health systems? How do we kind of progress and move forward? Many diseases, and I know there were individuals of us talking today, don't have codes. We can't necessarily find that data. And so now what starts happening for us is now we have this notion of uncertainty. So you're uncertain in what your estimate is going to be in cost. We just heard from Lisa, we're uncertain in where we are with qualities, or perhaps where it might stand. And now we're in a very small patient population. What that gives us is this wide band of cost per quality and kind of where items are starting to go. And so now what that says is this report as a starting point now has a whole lot of uncertainty that's within it. We can deal with it. There are ways we can, methodologically, that we can handle this. The question comes by is the conversation. How do we handle that element? That really talks about that there's other parts of this whole value assessment that's really going to be important. It's not just going to be the cost effectiveness, but it's really what that last panel was talking about. It's that capturing this information where, again, with a rare disease, it's telling a story so that when John and we go talk to Brineura, that he's able to see how that information is. And when we start talking about the ICER report, there's greater value in that part. So let's go back to developing and manufacturing. How does that all end up as far as in the pricing component? In large part, the way we kind of look at it is research, development, all that, that's at the very front end of our decision making. We are saying, what is the environment that we're going into? What do we know well about the patient population? And that's kind of more or less where our research and development is looking at. When we get to the pricing element, the pricing element truly is about what is the burden of our disease, where is the benefit that the therapy will have, what's currently available as standard of care. So directly, should development and reimbursement costs be part of that discussion? No, but indirectly it is. Indirectly because it's all about how do we start thinking about how we're going to move forward with what research we need to be undertaking. Number two, it's also that underlying other part that I just talked about in cost effectiveness, that the portion that the other panel has spoken about, that it's in there, it's a small population, it's what are the other variables as far as therapies. It's in that element that a lot of that research and development cost would be found. And that's going to be an important part of the overall conversation we have.
All right. Without too much forethought, David, could you respond to that or to the bigger picture of some of the other questions? I guess part of me is wondering from a patient's perspective, And I know, you talked about your specific condition. But sometimes, we spend a lot of time, certainly ICER does, talking about methods, and people are kind of more interested in the end of the line. What decisions are going to be made?
Don't use that word.
How much?
Don't use that word. The end of the line, bad word.
At the end
Bad
of the
phrase.
day, end of the day. So I think back to the gentleman who kept running for mayor of New York. He kept, the rent is too damned high. I mean, basically, patients want better treatments. They want treatments for conditions that are severe and have never been able to be treated at all. They want especially help for their children, and everybody wants it to be affordable. So how do we use the tools that we've got? And again, sometimes it's easy just to pitch something, and I'm trying not to pick on any drug, but Spinraza. So we know what its price was. We all know that nobody knew what the price was going to be. Wall Street analysts always chatter and they try to figure it out. And then the price comes out and people kind of say, oh. And usually these days it's O with other O's after it. But for the ultra rare, it's been an increasing number. And so the question is, okay, for the first year it was 750,000, then somewhere in the 300s for each year after that. I guess part of the question we're trying to grapple with is how do we use our tools to decide whether that's aligned with the added value to patients and some of these other benefits and things we're talking about. If it's not 750,000, why couldn't it be 7,500 or 7.5 million? None of these numbers have any magic to them. So how do we start to have the conversation and talk about pricing and value in a kind of a structured way? So what does that look like from a patient's perspective? And then we'll kind of keep going around.
Well, first of all, we want to bring new drugs to market, and we want to bring new cures, new mechanisms of action that will help people with chronic and acute diseases. And we want incentives so that those drugs will be developed. Then comes ICER. And I think there's a fundamental question for me, is ICER trying to determine the value of the drug, or is ICER trying to suggest a price based on the value of the drug, and then what are the component pieces of value? Matt suggests that disease burden should be an issue. Are we avoiding increased care costs because the drug reduced the need for hospitalizations and ongoing care that might have been needed to be given? And then we get to this sort of big Uber question about society, and if there are limited resources, how will those resources be expended? I don't like the latter 2 points because I believe that I'm debating on the wrong ground, both in terms of, is it only about the value of the drug vis-a-vis the items that Matt enumerated, or is it about the cost of the drug, the cost that was expended to get the drug? Should that be a factor in setting price? We're not talking about cell phones. We're talking about public goods, and goods that can mean life or death for people, real people. And so if we're going to have a discussion about limited resources, and if we're really trying to get to price, then I think we need to include, and I said this at the outset this morning, the investment that was made to develop the drug, and for society to have an ethical discussion about what is an appropriate level of compensation to the investors who took risks. Every pharmaceutical company should also have to pay $50 in the jar when they say the words, "it's complicated," to a patient. It's not that complicated. We have a policy in the United States. We do not have a free market for prescription drugs. Our prescription drug prices are set based on government policy that enables monopoly pricing power. There's no free market for drugs. Avik Roy, a noted Republican thinker and free market guy, just wrote a paper last week. And again, emphasized the point that we don't have a market for drugs that is free. It's all based on government policy. The government policy enables monopoly pricing power. If we're going to have that, then we need to look at, should that exist in terms of allowing prices to be set and the analysis that you undertake. So I want to make sure that when ICER does its analyses that we are trying to get to what is a fair price, and what is a fair price isn't just based on who lives and who dies, but who makes how much money off of it. And if we leave that out in order to enable continued monopoly pricing power by drug companies, then ethically, as a society, we're making a big mistake.
All right. Point noted. Good. Let me ask Kenneth now to weigh in on either a reaction or, again, you can freelance into any of the areas that are on the table right now as we talk about pricing, the tools of cost effectiveness, and kind of affordability in terms of thinking about value.
So I think one aspect is just to start off by saying about the value part, the value to an individual patient. I think that's important. I don't think that should go away in the analysis, that we want effective drugs that provide a specific value to individual patients. That, I think, still needs to be part of the equation and still needs to be assessed and brought into kind of the overall equation that I think is going to have to bring all of these different components together to really come up with a final answer on it. Saying that, though, I don't think the rarity part really influences that direct-to-patient value that much. I think it's these other components when you start to look at the caregiver burden, those other aspects of value need to be brought in as well into that kind of that calculation. But now kind of talking about the pricing and the cost of research, I think that is very critical in this area, in addition to the value as well. I think for us in SMA, our whole model was really, I think, built to get an approved treatment based on providing incentives to industry to come into our ultra-orphan disease. We did this through many different channels, help in recruiting for clinical trials, information from patients. We really kind of looked at every way that we could to reduce the risks for industry and provide incentives for industry to come in, because otherwise this research would never have happened. We would not end up with an approved treatment without industry coming in and making those investments in the costs of research. So I think we look at the cost of research, and I think we know that we can't do it on our own. Right. We need that support. The cost of research doesn't go down proportionally because you're in an ultra-orphan disease. There's still very high costs. They're certainly lower than when you're talking about the common diseases, but it still costs hundreds of millions of dollars to do effective clinical trials in a rare disease. So those costs need to come in, be funded from somewhere, and industry for us is the only way that that's actually going to come into an orphan disease like ours. So there, I think, is where price actually comes in the incentive part as well. Price to us, I think, is one of these aspects of incentives to industry to come into an ultra-orphan disease. I think we've looked at that as something which has pulled the early research forward, not having restrictions, not having companies have to weigh up, is there going to be a restriction on the price if they get an approved therapy? Having that incentive there to make the investments in early clinical trials and all the way through. I think the other aspect that I might say for us right now is we want the second and third, fourth approvals to come through. We're not done. We don't have our cure. We have a treatment, and that's great. For us, though, we're now really focused on what are the incentives for the second, third companies to come in. We don't look at Spinraza as a monopoly on SMA, and it isn't. Our whole goal now is to have other therapies that are going to come through from other industry investment. And frankly, there as well, the incentive is still price. The incentive for these other companies now to come in and actually create competition is from the pricing component as well. So I think price has, it's not the whole incentive part, there's other areas, but it has a role early in research to bring those investments in. Right. And it actually has a role after the first approval for other treatments as well to still come through. So I think we definitely look at the cost of research as important, something that we look at, and I think has to come into this calculation beyond just direct patient value, the other aspects of value to caregivers, the price incentive needs to be there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really valuable perspective. And again, you know, the tension, we can say affordability, but, you know, patient advocates know exactly what you say, which is that the ability to price high and to gain great rewards are part of getting people to pay attention and to develop new drugs, and not just the first, but the others as well. So you face your own struggle perhaps a little bit with trying to not reconcile, but balance these two instincts. One is you want it to be covered and you want affordable coverage, but you also want those incentives to stay high enough to bring in new innovation, right? Pat, what do you think? React to this, and also ultimately you're going to be kind of, one of the people we'll turn to say, should ICER change its cost effectiveness threshold? Should we just keep doing what we do and let you factor in whether the rarity should give it a premium? Should we leave cost effectiveness aside because when you want to look at evidence on a rare or ultra rare condition, you really don't care about the cost effectiveness? You want to know how many patients, what's the cost, how do we make sure it gets to the right patients? Modulate for us how you think the tools that ICER brings into our reports, in a sense, should feed best into the kinds of decisions you want to make.
I'd say I would like you to continue to do cost effectiveness even in the ultra rare conditions. It's helpful for us. You have a range of 50 to 150,000. That's a threefold range. I think that gets forgotten. The media only picks up the 150 and declares it's cost effective, for example, for multiple sclerosis in reports. Everybody seems to talk about your 150 threshold, but you do have a range of 50 to 150. We would hope that pharmaceutical manufacturers can start working toward the 50 and less toward the goal of, can I price it as much as I can to get in an ICER report, for example, at 150, and then we're good.
So on that point specifically, what if the company is making a drug for a patient population of 1,000 people, and it's not a cure, but it's a treatment that works and improves their quality of life? Is there a number of a return on that investment with 1,000 patients that if the cost effectiveness threshold were 200, 300, 400,000, but that meant that the company was going to make 50 million or 100 million and not more? I mean, do you think about...
I would feel comfortable if we could have that in a fair conversation
about
of
that.
the
Okay.
profitability and the cost to invest, which we've not had a fair conversation in that. And I'll give you an example, I think very pertinent to this conversation we're having right now, is since September, there have been 4 orphan or ultra-orphan drugs approved. And incredulously, they're all priced the same. They're all 700,000-ish. Beginning with Exondys, then Radicava, Brineura, and I'm sorry, Spinraza, Brineura, and now Radicava as of a couple days ago. Amazingly, they're all 700,000. So I guess I challenge, I know maybe Glaxo's working off a different model to price it, but it appears to me that it's just, the market is, a $700,000 number now has been set, and that's what we'll bring, no matter what the cost to deliver the product is, because that's the cost I see for 4 drugs now. And I also say that when looking for Exondys claims in our 15 million commercially insured lives, found 2 patients that appear to be currently receiving at least a few months of therapy. Mm-hmm. We have a 10-year-old that's costing, and this is after all discounts. So there's also this talk about that, well, that price out there, 700,000, is not the real number. That is the real number, by the way, because there are no rebates on these products, and there's a minimal WAC discount that occurs. So that being said, the actual cost for a few months of therapy for a 10-year-old is $800,000 that we're currently paying in real claim costs, or our Blues plans are paying. And a 23-year-old, because it's weight-based, $2.8 million. So these are the real numbers. And I'll also just add one more point. So a small self-insured employer at about 500,000, I'm sorry, at about 500 employees. 500 employees, that's the definition, the threshold of small business in the United States. Those 500 employees, we'll say that there's a 2.4 multiplier on that, and you've got 1,200 lives that you're insuring. The premiums you will collect to pay for all of their health care is about 5.6 million. So if you manage to catch that 23-year-old that needs Exondys, that individual now is half of all the cost to pay for all health care for 1,200 individuals. And that probably puts that small business out of business if they didn't have reinsurance, and they may not be in business next year because whether or not that reinsurance will cover that exogenous is questionable. So, I mean, these are the real challenges. I think we have this perspective that there's just all this money out there, and we can just pay for everything. And by the way, 1 in 10 people, we heard earlier, has a rare disease. So as more and more of these products, we've had 4 in the last 7, 8 months, they're coming in at 700,000, it's not scalable.
All right. I know some people would at least want to question whether part of that tension that you're feeling is a failure of the insurance system to be able to spread risk over big enough populations. Because anytime we bring the numbers down and try to share risk, we're going to potentially end up with
But it is
some.
the system that we're working in.
I appreciate it.
We may even,
I appreciate
with the changes to Medicaid, may even have a more difficult
Right.
scenario in
Right.
the near future.
Matt, did you want to jump in on that?
David and Pat are raising very valid issues that we have right now. And much like where ICER has really kind of helped change the discussion about what value and kind of how do we kind of have this conversation, you know, there is this reality that we know that there are other therapies, gene therapies, CAR-Ts. We know that there are areas even in anti-infectives. They're starting to come down that the current payment system, the current financing approach that we have right now doesn't seem to make sense, right? It doesn't seem to really kind of fit. And we know that there are groups like Duke Margolis or MIT Newdigs that are starting to ask the question of why are we paying for this? How do we make sure that we're going to hit that there's affordability for patients, but affordability for the healthcare system? How do we make sure that there is the ability to have access where appropriate? More or less, how do we make sure that there's the ability for innovation to support? I know there's many of individuals here in this meeting that are actually part of this to try to start saying, this is not easy. Where we're going to, which is now getting to this point of long-term durability for therapies, it cannot necessarily stand up to where it has a single point of therapy and there's again, long-term benefit, and we try to figure out what that cost is or what that value could be or what that price is. And so I think in large part, a lot of these discussions that we're having right here are things that we are going to have to wrestle with as a country, where we say, how do we go about financing this moving forward? Which I know is beyond what we're talking about here, the ICER, which is
No, it was
how do we
close to
value
saying social
how do we
dialogue,
yeah,
close-
how do we
close to
value
it.
how do we
Right.
value in the current system?
Right.
But I
Yes.
did
All
want
right,
to
so
raise that.
let me push you on one point, then I want to ask Rick a question too. But so you mentioned some of the elements that go into the thinking around pricing. Pat reflected how it can seem like these numbers have a life of their own, and they seem to crest at a certain number until the next new leap, and then they crest at a higher number. We just had an experience through ICER where a manufacturer came to us to ask about our approach to cost effectiveness and what it would suggest would be a fair price. And they took that number as part of their consideration in discussing with payers around coverage to make sure that patients could try to have good access. So it was an explicit approach to thinking about price that was explicit. It wasn't, there are these 3 factors and they equal 700 or whatever thousand. They were actually willing to kind of do the numbers, if you will. In rare conditions, is there any reason that we shouldn't hope that that would be at least part of the discussion, that the 700s do seem to come out of nowhere, even though we can hear the terms used of what is behind it? We don't see a calculation that suggests that this equals a certain amount for every additional life gained, or they can define it in different ways. But can you talk to us about the possibility and the potential barriers to more explicit use of these tools in thinking about pricing from the manufacturer's perspective?
Trying to speak for all manufacturers, I think, is going to be pretty broad.
Well, I think the pink sheet is here, so we'll consider you're talking for all manufacturers.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you're bringing up a good point. I mean, I think where a lot of conversations, what we've been seeing that occurs either at Harvard Pilgrim or what we've been seeing with ESI, I mean, we're really starting to have this notion that there's these conversations about how do you go about setting a price, setting contracts, setting items up so that it makes sense for a value conversation. I can't talk about all the other companies, as I just mentioned. What I can say is the way that we are looking at this is kind of the variables I had talked about, which is what is the burden of the disease, or else what do we think has been the outcome that we have shown, and at the same time, what is more or less kind of what we can sit down from a scientific perspective. Without tooting our own, right? I mean, for us, our last 6 assets that we've launched have all been priced at parity or below whatever's in the market. And that was because that's what we said when we did our assessments of where things went. Now, would we ever come to you to talk about where our prices might be? We are always open to try to understand what the value discussion should be, much like we would like to be able to talk to a lot of the payers. We talk to patient populations, patient advocacy groups. It's always about trying to understand what is the price. Again, what I would go back is, as we're starting to talk about rare disease, or we start talking about gene therapy, we're starting to talk about things that are quite different, right? We have, I know you get tired of me when I say this, but we have 21st century therapies, and we have a 16th century approach for paying for this, right, in insurance. With that being said, we need to really kind of rethink of the direction we need to go to. And that's why we're very excited about where Duke Margolis is going, where MIT is going. More importantly, where a lot of the conversations are starting to evolve right now with a lot of the payers and others.
All right. I'm going to let you off the hook.
At parity or below, and I think that's the challenge, because 700,000 has become the parity number. So, I mean, I just heard that from Matt that the pricing, we brought our drugs to market at parity or below. And I find that difficult to swallow.
Well, let me just step into the middle and acknowledge that, you know, there are business models for insurers that make it hard to do certain things because of the risk of adverse selection. And that's kind of the business world in which they live. Even if they might want to do certain things, adverse selection can serve as a constraint. For manufacturers, they have shareholders, they have a market system in which they're existing, and they have certain constraints about maybe what they would want to do or could do. And so we're all going to try to figure out how to move this forward. We're all going to have to figure out how to do this together. But it does raise some questions. So Rick, I was going to ask you to go back outside the United States. So we're dealing with 21st century cures and 16th century. We weren't even here in the 16th century, but maybe the conquistadors, but no one else. And the Native Americans. So anyway, take us overseas. So they've been wrestling with this for many, many years, many of them through formal governmental channels, so that lends a certain kind of legitimacy, if you will, bureaucracy for sure. But tell us again what you think some of the lessons are to be learned from the international experience about using cost effectiveness and thresholds, approaches to even the decision-making process and thinking about things like budget impact. Does there seem to be an evolving consensus overseas, or is everybody kind of off in their own cul-de-sac trying to figure this out?
I'm not sure if there's really a consensus. I think there does seem to be some settling on some standards around certain methods, but I think that's once you decide which method you're going to use. But from country to country, I think there is still a lot of variation in which methods they choose to use. I think for some countries, in some ways, it's easier to do some of these analyses and make decisions around this because they have less of a hybrid system. I think what we've heard here a lot is that we have a market, we have businesses in this market, but it's a very regulated market. It's a very hybrid market. And we've had policies around how we're going to regulate that market, which try to balance the incentives for innovation and the need for affordability. And I think those have worked well for years. But I think what we're seeing is that there's more of a consensus that it's not working so well now, that for various different reasons that's starting to break down and that balance isn't there. So I think it's a little harder here because I think we have to have conversations around what is the right policy to get that balance between innovation and affordability right. I think in other countries it's maybe a little easier to do that because it is much more in the public sphere, and they're used to talking about this more explicitly on a policy level. I think one of the things that would help here is for some of the things that we've been talking about to be more explicit and to be more out in the open so that people can talk about what is the right level of profitability for a drug, or if a drug can't be brought to market for a certain population and still be cost effective, how should we go about getting that to patients?
Yeah. I'm unfamiliar, and again, maybe some of you in the audience know, but as much as we try to keep our ears to the ground, I'm not familiar with an explicit approach whereby they would say, a company bringing a drug with this much benefit gets this much return as a base or a minimum, and we'll look at the cost effectiveness, but there's kind of an explicit linkage of return to bringing a drug to market with cost effectiveness layered in some other way. All that I seem to read and even hear about are relatively kind of ad hoc procedures through committees that are, again, established through a governmental or arm's length body. But that's why it still feels like people are kind of wending their way through. We hear there was a really good case study from Sweden where they had said no to Cerezyme early on. I'm looking at Dan because he knows this case study, I hope, as well as I do, or better than I do. Anyway, and so they took back this whole decision process, and they said, maybe we need to increase our threshold with considerations of other kind of societal issues, et cetera. And they came back and said, okay, we are going to raise our threshold, and lo and behold, it still was nowhere close to the price meeting it. So Cerezyme was not covered in the Swedish health system. And of course, when it's a governmental approach, the ability to say no may have a little bit more, again, legitimacy. But obviously, we also know that, for instance, in the UK, an initial no is often used as a negotiation stance from which a lower price is achieved, and then the answer is yes. So I'd be curious now, just while we're focused on the international experience, does anybody out there think that a country's got it right, or at least has one part of it right, as far as how it should affect our approach to doing the value assessment and pricing piece? Did you want to comment on that? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, just a fantastic discussion on this topic. And, I think the important learning from the experience in Europe more recently is HTA is very prevalent in a number of countries. And where they've changed the criteria or the threshold, and in some cases decide to deprioritize this wasn't a change in the country in their commitment to HTA or to cost effectiveness. So they in no way were saying, we're going to move away from cost effectiveness. It was a recognition that the tool that they have in conditions that are very small and the data sets do not support, the ultimate models that were being created didn't support what they were trying to accomplish, which was ensuring that they're spending in the most efficient way. And so I just want to stress that the reasons these countries have decided to go away from cost effectiveness wasn't because they've changed. It's really because they recognize there are differences in the ability to use models to come to very credible answers that then they were able to stand behind. And for those who have worked on models, the assumptions that we use are the basis of everything, and those are criticized often. But the difference between what we deal with on many large populations where there's years of history, there's patient progression, there's been treatment interventions, versus what we're facing in the case of orphan drugs often where there's a sparsity of data, particularly for new interventions, you end up where it's very easy simply to change assumptions and you can get whatever answer. And that's the reason that's led to a deprioritization around cost effectiveness.
And is it fair to say that the countries that kind of modulate their use of cost effectiveness, they really do it for the ultra rare? I mean, what we would, however you want to define it. They don't do it for anything around 50 to 100,000 patient conditions. They would do it for the situation where they might have a relative handful of patients in their country.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's again part of that question of where along the spectrum do we decide to jump to a different canoe and try to paddle upstream. Yes.
I'm Amber Batata from Sanofi Genzyme. I just wanted to follow up on Chris's comment and then answer your question. But on Chris's comment in terms of cost effectiveness analysis in Europe, I think one of the things we should think about is that the way CEA is applied in Europe, and I'm going to use an example from England, doesn't necessarily result in outcomes that I think most Americans would agree with. So if you look at some of the reviews that have been done over the last 10 years in the UK, I'll give a couple of examples of things that were covered versus not covered versus delayed. So they have a tendency to delay or not cover certain of the rare drugs. In the case of smoking cessation, the fastest ever approval by NICE was Chantix from Pfizer. That's a smoking cessation product that in America, at least in the first 5 years, I don't know if it's changed since I left Pfizer, was a rider. So it was employer-based insurance. They might decide that they would tell their insurance plan that they wanted to cover Chantix, but it was not a common part of an American benefit. What was absolutely common in the US was Prevnar. The moment it came out, it was automatically recognized by the Preventive Services Task Force, whoever's in charge of vaccines, because it prevents pneumococcal meningitis, I think that's the disease, which is potentially fatal in children. It was immediately covered in the US. The UK, even though the physician community recommended it, NICE recommended it against, and it was a 5-year delay. An estimated 50 children a year would have gotten the disease and died over that 5-year delay. We would never have accepted that kind of a restriction in the US. So CEA is not always resulting in outcomes that I think culturally America would be comfortable with, and I think we want to remember that because a lot of the methods that we discuss originated in that sort of a cultural environment.
Oh, I just have to stop just for a second.
Yeah.
The methods actually originated in the United States more than 30 years ago. How they're applied within a decision-making structure is different country
applied
to
to
country.
healthcare
But the idea that this
decision-making,
is a
yes.
foreign virus that's infected our
I
bloodstream.
appreciate the correction. In terms of applying it to healthcare decision-making, I think it's applied more in a more regimented way in the
It can
UK
be,
relative to the
right.
US. In terms of what system is better, I think we've discussed this somewhat, but I'll make a more explicit statement. So I work for Sanofi Genzyme, and I'm the head of value and access on their rare portfolio, so I help with the pipeline decision-making and design of clinical trials, et cetera, on both health economics and outcomes research. There's a team that supports us. The pricing and reimbursement is also part of this. And we're in a big company, Sanofi is a Big 10, where there's a competition for resources internally. And I can tell you, if you look at the expected net present discounted value of the various development programs that we could choose, if you applied a European method in terms of the pricing of a rare disease drug to across the board worldwide population, so assume that the US were to adopt a British model, for example, of pricing, it's not a claim by industry. It's literally the math would not work out. The net present discounted value of the rest of the portfolio was stronger, and the Genzyme business would disappear in that world. So the reality is we do actually need to justify the investment because there are very high risks to these programs, especially in a rare disease world. Nobody inside the bigger the company really understands rare diseases. They don't understand the endpoints. They don't understand the burden of illness. So you have to educate people within the company. You have to figure out what the clinical trial endpoints are, and it's easy to say ex post, that endpoint made a lot of sense. Ex ante, we didn't know that the FDA would necessarily approve it, that we were going to be statistically significant, and that we were going to hit it in the trial. And then you have to convince payers. So when you add all of that uncertainty together, in addition to deciding that you want to regulate profits or regulate pricing, you are actually creating a serious challenge for justifying those investments moving forward. And I think we should keep that in mind.
Thanks. I'm going to ask you a real quick follow-up question. So if we assume that the cost effectiveness ratios or thresholds that ICER will use and by extension others will think of as a fair return on the value that's added to patients. And you're suggesting that that level may not, because we don't, in a sense ours are much higher because America is a wealthier society, so our numbers are much higher than Britain's or anywhere else's. Are you suggesting that even more is needed to be able to create the return on investment for orphan diseases? And I guess the question would be an extension to that if the answer is yes. How do people start to get their hands around how much more? Because, again, I'll just posit, not 700,000, but next year we'll have the meeting and we'll maybe have the current threshold for top price drugs closer to 1 million. Gene therapies will come out with very small populations in which we may even see higher prices. So I guess part of the question is, if we want to acknowledge the tensions and the trade-offs of investment even within a company like that, how do we still build some way to think transparently about how much premium is enough or fair in some way?
So I'm an economist by training. I don't usually think in terms of people deciding what is a fair return. The market sort of decides that, and you either choose to pay or you don't choose to pay. So I wouldn't generally, and this isn't because I work at pharma, but because of my just professional background, I would not generally support the profit regulation or the price regulation sort of approach. I'm not sure I would also advocate within pharma. I don't know that I would advocate for a specific threshold. When you set thresholds, people might try to price to the threshold, which when you think people are pricing too high and you set the threshold lower, maybe that works out in your favor, but once you set the threshold, maybe there are other drugs that aren't worth so much and they'll just raise the price. I think there are nuances and you want to do this on a drug-by-drug basis, but I don't know what threshold would really work in the rare space, especially because ex ante, we really don't know what outcomes we need to measure in order to get past the FDA, much less get those cost-effectiveness analysis models to work.
Right. I want to plant a seed, not because I want to let other people comment too, but I want to plant a seed to suggest that we all have to work together to a way to know whether a $7 million per year drug is, because the company has the monopoly on pricing until there's competition. We've given them that through the policy structure, so it's not a free market. We've given them that ability to price. We know there are reasons they don't price it that way today, but I would suggest in the context of this meeting that it's largely because they think that that would break the system, not because there's any other kind of value-based way that it's not worth $7 million. They want to try to maximize return as a company without breaking the system in which they're operating. So we have to figure out a way, because it feels like we don't have a way to make a good judgment. You know, if we're not going to use our standard cost-effectiveness thresholds, we have to come up with some other way to talk about value and pricing in a way that will help us all kind of get some kind of progress going forward.
Steve?
Alan, and then, okay, David, Alan, and then we'll keep going. Yes.
I think it's really important to point out with regard to what Americans will tolerate vis-a-vis the European system and the point that was made. We have effective rationing of healthcare and drugs in this country now. Financial toxicity is a very real feature of people's lives. Since we launched Patients for Affordable Drugs on February 22nd, we've collected 7,000 patient stories. We have, it is not rare conditions, but we have insulin users who write and say, I can't afford my insulin, so I'm trying to manage my type 1 diabetes with diet and exercise. I'm not taking the recommended dose and hoping I don't go into insulin shock. RA patients who are saying, I'm in terrible pain, I cut my pills in half, I don't take the recommended dose. People who say, I'm having to choose between buying my food and buying my drugs. People who can't afford to get the drugs they need. So, if there are explicit decisions being made in Europe that are affecting availability, at least there is a process that is undertaken that tries to figure out what is a fair and reasonable approach in light of societal standards. In this country, we just screw people. And we accept that it's okay because it's supposedly a free market, but there is no free market for prescription drugs in this country. It doesn't exist. The market is set based on government policy, which allows drug companies to have exclusive pricing rights for 5 or 7 years, and then many of them delay the arrival of generics to market. The framework was set by Hatch-Waxman in 1983. It allows that to happen, and it still allows the abuses by drug companies to take place. So the 2 points I'm trying to make: A, there is no free market for drugs in this country, and we should not fool ourselves that there is, and B, choices are made here in this country that deny people access to life-saving drugs, and we allow it to happen.
Alan.
So, David, you said much of what I was going to say, but I wanted, because I was going to reference your earlier ethical framework and why it may be important what the cost of manufacture of a drug is. I don't care what it costs to manufacture a computer or what it costs to manufacture a car. I go out, it's a free, really is much more of a free market. There are rules around what cars have to have for safety. And I make a personal decision where I pay for that computer or that car and the variable qualities of it. That's a typical free market. Our economist, I'm sure, understands that well. But in this space, the purchaser really isn't the user or even the prescriber, except very indirectly. So when I choose about a drug or not a drug, I'm not paying the full cost or making that cost-benefit determination personally. But second, there are incredible disequilibrium in the rules and regulations about what has to be covered in insurance benefits or Medicare or a variety of environments that are regulatory. And Steve, I'll put $1 in the pot for the societal decisions made versus the societal decisions made about what the pricing can be produced by in the pricing of these drugs. Because of that disequilibrium, they can be priced, as pointed out, at almost any price that doesn't cause a government backlash, a pure government backlash. People have said the only irrational, economically irrational thing Gilead did in its pricing of Harvoni was that they didn't price it at twice the price, because there was nothing that would prevent them from maximizing their returns even more other than the backlash issue. So I think that the issue of the disequilibrium between the rules around what has to be covered and provided in benefit plans and in Medicare, et cetera, and what the rules and regulations around pharmaceutical pricing bring the question of what does manufacturing cost and what are ethical returns to the forefront of a very reasonable question, different than what we would ever consider around cars or computers.
All right, thank you. I know there was another, yeah, Michael. I'm sorry, I'll go over there.
Yeah, thank you. So many great comments here. So putting a few of these together, as a number of you have mentioned, for drugs generally, particularly high-cost drugs, the individual doesn't pay the lion's share. And again, it doesn't mean that affordability isn't a problem, but both because health plans think about limits because they want people to get the drugs that are prescribed, as well as the ACA maximum, which is $7,000 and change for an individual and $14,000 plus for a family. That limits the out-of-pocket, which means that generally when you see these type of price tags, you're not paying for it so much as everyone's paying for it. I also thought there was a good comment before, and I agreed with it, about it used to be $300,000. I remember back a couple of years ago, good old days, we heard $300,000 and we thought that's expensive. And now, you're right, now $700 is the new $300. And so it strikes me we're not that far off from a point where we see $1 million drugs. And again, maybe they're worth it. Just let's not even debate that. Here, we're talking about societal discussions, determinations, et cetera. Let's do some math here. Let's say that at some point in the future, we have $1 million drugs, and let's say they're great drugs, and that they're for 0.1% of our population. We would then need to go to the regulators as an insurer and say, guess what? We need to raise the premium for next year for every man, woman, and child by $1,000. And that's math, okay? That's not... what kind of societal dialogue do you think that would lead to when it now does impact everyone, not just a few individuals? Any thoughts?
Personally, I think you'd get a whole different reaction if, in fact, everybody had skin in this game. That's just me.
We do.
I do, yes. I do want to correct one thing. Medicare Part D does not have an out-of-pocket max. So I was on a drug for 5.5 years called Revlimid. The median out-of-pocket for a Medicare Part D beneficiary taking Revlimid is $11,500 a year. The median income of a Medicare beneficiary is $26,200 a year.
Right.
This is wrong.
I acknowledge that
So
may be a real issue. I agree.
In many cases, certainly in Medicare under Part D, and old people are the sick people, they are paying thousands and thousands. In fact, from the top 12 most expensive Medicare Part D drugs, $4,400 a year out of pocket to $11,500 a year out of pocket.
Great. I know, did you have a comment? Yes, please.
More a question, just in terms of, as we're talking about, I think the commissioner laid out policies to try to reduce net overall costs for the healthcare system. So increasing competition, which is something that you actually talked about, so companies don't abuse, exclusivity after 5 or 7 years, increased competition from generics or biosimilars. So when you're thinking about this construct and value-based, where does that lie in terms of other initiatives to bring down costs across healthcare?
Are you talking in terms of ICER's work specifically?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we do topics, we do most of our reports now are on drug topics, but we do look at other kinds of interventions in the healthcare system. And actually, it's going to be part of our update to all of our reports. We're going to try to introduce a new element to our reports that will basically invite opportunities to suggest ways to save money and other ways to make headroom for innovation, to try to make sure that that's a more robust part of the conversation going forward. But otherwise, our approach is to try to provide evidence as objectively and transparently synthesized as possible to stimulate the kinds of conversations and thinking about value among different stakeholders. So that's basically our approach. Great to see him. Yes, please.
Yeah, Harold Carter from Express Scripts. So, great discussion. I think there's a few comments I want to just reflect on is drugs being approved for rare indications versus drugs that are in the market and getting additional approvals for rare indications, right? So there's a clear distinction with that. So there's biologics that are out there that have been approved, and manufacturers have justified that to increase the price. And that's an issue as well as the $700,000 issue that we're talking about here. From a societal perspective, I think we have to remember in the United States, and Pat talked about this, that from a societal perspective, there's not a single payer system, right? We have employers that know these patients that are sick. They want to get them the medication, but at the end of the day, they say, I either pay for this or I go out of business. What is my opportunity? Now, you can spread costs and manage your diabetes spend, you can manage your high blood pressure spend, but the reality is that this is 1/5 of the spend long term, right? So you can only cut out costs somewhere else before it becomes too much. So those are some other issues. I think really also what we have to think about is the dialogue that manufacturers are having in other countries that they're not having with payers today. So when you think about other countries, like, if you look at Sweden, you look at all these different countries, manufacturers are having to basically come in at a price point or else the society's just not going to cover it, right? That doesn't happen today. So the perception I get from some of the comments that have been made and that I've heard in other words is, okay, we're going deeper everywhere else, and is the United States in essence subsidizing the rest of the country? I think or the rest of the world. I think that's a fundamental issue that we see. So from our perspective, we want you guys to have the same dialogue that you're having with these other countries to get on point. And maybe it comes to a point where some employers, and many are getting here, that say, I just won't cover it. So I know that you want to return an investment to your investors, but you can't return a percentage of zero, right? So 20% of zero is $0, right? If no one's going to fill your medication. So I think that is fundamentally something that I know we have to return shares, to our investors and things of that nature. But in any other marketplace, whether you're going to the grocery store or anything like that, right? Whether I decide to go to Schnucks back where I'm from or Shop and Save, I don't care what their profits are. I'm looking at who's going to be able to provide me the best cost or the best price for that product. And you saw that obviously when we talked about Sovaldi and what Gilead did. You obviously saw Express Scripts go a little bit to war in that area, and we were successful. But those are the issues as we're talking through this that I really want you guys to really make sure that we're thinking about. Up to this point, frankly, I don't think pharma is necessarily having an honest and open discussion with us in the U.S., especially the way that they're engaging other countries. I know there's some complexity to that, but at this point, if you use some drugs where we've, like in the Hep C space, right, we've seen that those drugs are significantly cheaper in other countries than they are here. So as we're having this discussion, is $700 the mark? What is your research and development? I understand all those. There's acts where the government is actually subsidizing you guys to help bring some of those to the marketplace. So that argument, to me, seems a challenge. But so those are things that I just want us to keep in mind as we're walking through this, because I understand that this is a tough discussion. We need to look at it, but keep in mind, patients are at the end of the table of this, right, of getting access. We've heard those awesome stories about what these drugs can do for patients, but fundamentally, at the end of the day, when you look out by 2020 or something like that, some folks are legitimately going to start covering these meds. And so, you know, Matt, from your organization, from the folks at my site, from Chris, from Biogen, what are you guys going to tell your investors at that point? Those are the things I think you guys have to take an honest look at, because these aren't spaces where, you know, as Pat mentioned, there are no discounts. There is nothing that's out there. This is pure profit, and this is pure cost that pharma's setting the price for.
Yes.
I just wanted to
Sorry,
comment.
can you introduce yourself?
Hi, Francesca Cook with REGENXBio. Just wanted to comment a little bit on the points made by Express Scripts.
Hold that really close. Just pull it closer.
Closer, okay, great.
you go.
So REGENXBio's in gene therapy world, we have a number of ultra-orphan products. We're talking not 20,000 patients, maybe 1 in 100,000 across the globe. And when you look at the actual addressable population that you're actually going to get to, much smaller than that. And then the prevalent pool is small. And we're talking a one-time therapy. None of us will succeed if we're not able to actually get our therapies, which we believe are transformative, bordering on curative, to the patients who need them. So we certainly aren't trying to set up a system where we are unaffordable, and thus, you know, small health plans are going out of business. I think we all only win if we're able to get our technologies to the patient. But you do have to look at a very tiny number of patients that you may be treating, and after you treated them once, they have hopefully transformative, curative, and then the incident population is very, very tiny. So it is kind of a conundrum. And when Matt mentioned needing to think about alternative reimbursement or financing, I mean, that's important and that's real. We're going to have transformative therapies. We need to transform our system. We don't want to sort of break the bank, but we also want to find a mechanism that allows us to move from perhaps chronic care to curative care, and to at least be able to cover your costs with reasonable profit on top of that. And so I think this is something we're going to have to come to terms with and grapple with and come to some solution, because I think the medical system is changing, and we've got to be able to change with it.
Yeah, and I would say from Express Scripts' perspective, we are always happy to have those discussions, getting out ahead of time and really talking about what are payers looking for, what's the value of drug. I think those are all important. I still grapple with the concept of that being the case, and we see such disparities in pricing from country to country that still, I think, raises a lot of questions and eyebrows around what's actually truly happening here. But, you know, what I would say is not all manufacturers are bad, right? There's been some very clear-cut scenarios where we've been able to really partner with manufacturers as well as our plan sponsors to create some great solutions that we were able to expand access to care. So that is the end goal for us as an organization. But at the same time, right, there has to be some realization on what's a realistic price for a drug and what's not. And some of those efficiencies may be, I mean, manufacturers have been around for how long? You see that they're not only the way they do studies, but also manufacture these drugs. There's an expectation of efficiency over time. So surely you're pulling some waste out of your own production.
I'm just going to, that's a good comment. I think I'm going to try to wrap that in. I know how this topic bleeds into so many different aspects of how we think about affordability, and both now and in the future, and innovation and access. I want to bring it back. And first of all, I did want to comment, many of you know that the ICER membership had a policy summit on gene therapy specifically. And some of the issues we addressed there certainly overlap with things we're talking about today. And there were a series of policy recommendations made about the evidence package and about how value could be assessed, and also about different options for longer-term payment options. So for those of you who are interested, there's that to look at. I want to pull it back to the value and cost effectiveness piece of this again, and just kind of gauge the sense of the room, because if there is a treatment for a let's say that's a condition of children, a genetic condition by which the children die by age 5. If there's a treatment that gives them a full life, the price at a current cost per quality threshold approach used for prevalent conditions, I did the math at one point, but I decided not to bring it with me, or maybe I've got it. Anyway, the price would be quite high. A one-time price would be in the 7 million range. If it was a one-time shot that cured a fatal disease for a kid who would die by age 5 and gave them a full life, and we wanted to pay $100,000 to $150,000 for each year, the price would be quite high. Similarly, we see a lot of, not all, but at least some orphan conditions where the gains are incremental. And we all think now about those kind of genetically defined subpopulations of cancer where the marginal gain may be a few months and the prices are very high. The cost per qualities are very high. So I'm kind of curious about where we think we're going with cost effectiveness again. I mean, we've talked about it being a part of the decision-making process around value. ICER has a specific way that it has used to say, here's the cost effectiveness, here's a value-based price range. And yes, there are other considerations. For rare conditions, should we do the same thing? Would you like to see an ICER price for that treatment, which would be very, very high? Would you like to see it done? Would you like cost effectiveness not to be, again, part of the discussion when there are certain criteria around the rarity? We need to kind of, I think, start to think concretely about what are we going to do. And I'll just say it again. The English took their standard threshold and said, we're going to multiply that by 3 to 4 times, come up with a nice round figure of 100,000 pounds per quality. Oh, and by the way, if they don't meet that, there is another little spill-off mechanism where they can go through another branch of the National Health Service and get other consideration. But they decided to draw a line in the sand and say, that's what we're going to do. We're going to increase our cost effectiveness threshold. So I'm kind of curious about the temperature of the room, and I'll ask Lisa's opinion as an academic expert to kick us off. Thinking about cost effectiveness tool as a way to think about a value-based price, risks and benefits of continuing to do that even as we get lower and lower in terms of the number of patients and other particular criteria. Lisa?
So I just wanted to start by commenting that there's very limited evidence with which to support a single threshold for rare diseases across the board. Given the heterogeneity of all the conditions that are included within the definition, whichever definition you use, it's unlikely that it would be easy to find a single threshold, although the UK has done it. But to comment on that, I want to lend a perspective from having been a member of the evidence review work group for the ACTINC, the Advisory Committee for Heritable Disorders in Newborns and Children, which sets the recommended uniform screening panel for newborn screening, and so has considered many of the questions that have come up here today around evaluating evidence for very rare diseases, for very small numbers, having very limited long-term evidence. And to make a comment that one of the questions that came up before was around the challenges of modeling these conditions, and that's certainly something that we've come up against. In the committee, economic evidence can be considered, but it's rare that for any of the conditions that we've considered so far, that there has been economic evidence that's available. And that which has been available has been very variable, that there's been a lot of uncertainty, little robustness across those results, except for a couple of conditions. And so for our group, we're not commissioned to conduct cost-effectiveness analyses, but we are doing decision models to support population health impact. So to be able to model what the potential health benefits are to the population for adding screening for a new condition, and even for developing these very simple decision models, we are really challenged by the lack of evidence. And so just a comment in terms of the consideration of a threshold or a different threshold that included some type of risk-sharing agreement would be extremely challenging to conduct for any of these disorders here, just given the scarcity of the data that's available. But then just to come back to thinking about thresholds in general, that I think in terms of what we know from the willingness to pay evidence, that there isn't very much to support the notion that that there could be a separate willingness to pay threshold for a condition that's rare, if that's the only characteristic that we have. But we know that that many of these rare conditions, have characteristics that there is a lot of willingness to pay evidence that would support potentially a higher threshold, and those include the age of the patient, so looking at children, if there were additional spillover effects, but also the severity of the condition. And so coming back, to that question around, how do we define the value of a health benefit, and is equality? That if we had to make trade-offs between, say, a condition, that was a life-saving treatment compared to, had the same exact cost-effectiveness ratio as a treatment that saved, across the board, say population-wise, millions of episodes of the flu, that taken together, that might be an equivalent number of qualities. But if faced in a decision-making situation that people's preferences, societal preferences would be to prefer the life-saving treatment, all else being equal. So I think in coming back to the framework, that be difficult to settle upon a specific threshold for rare conditions across the board, but to be able to characterize, each of these different potential characteristics or contextual attributes, and to characterize those within the framework, perhaps not going so far as to create an MCDA, but to have a structured framework which defined what each of those attributes were, what the definition was. I'm thinking about severity of the condition, what the level of family burden was, to be able to look at that systematically across treatments.
Thank you. Other comments or questions? So, yes, Pat.
I completely appreciate the example you gave. 2 points. One would be, would appreciate then if I still think a cost-effectiveness analysis is very important, A, and B, the budget threshold then is part of your analysis, so of your report, I should say. That is what also becomes very helpful, because every one of these, for example, Veridigen, that's going to likely potentially be approved this year for blindness, so it isn't death, but it's blindness of children. In that case, there's going to be a bolus, just like there was for Hep C. There's going to be a bolus of kids that are going to get treated in a very short months to year period of time. And we need to be able to understand how we're going to pay for that, especially since a large chunk of those kids are potentially in Medicaid on top of that with a fixed budget. And the other piece of it would be how your analysis will be very helpful in terms of the grayness that occurs, because it's not black and white in terms of the disease progression. And at what point do you say the drug maybe shouldn't be given because the kid is close to already blind or blind? I mean, those are the kind of the decisions that throughout their society are going to have to make, and especially Medicaid will have to make. Another good example is Radicava. There's 2 phase 3 studies. One is a failure study. It didn't work if you had any respiratory involvement with your ALS, with your Lou Gehrig's disease. The other showed that if you were pre-respiratory involvement, the drug did work. Now, the FDA label says it's FDA approved for all people with ALS. So if we're going to use the criteria of if we're going to follow the FDA label, then we're going to be giving drug to people that will not benefit from the drug. And so your analysis will help us understand from an economic standpoint on the quality of when do we, back to my question of when do we draw the line of start and stop.
Yeah, I was going to say, it may seem counterintuitive, but to us, trying to figure out where to do, especially the cost effectiveness on specific subpopulations, that applies just as much to rare and even ultra-rare conditions. So we might, for instance, in that data set, both talk about the clinical effectiveness, but we might have a different cost per quality, if you will, based on different clinical effectiveness within an FDA label, even if it is for a rare or ultra-rare condition. It just magnifies the difficulties, obviously, every time you take a small group of data and you try to slice it even more. But it's part of the thinking that's going to be going on as part of this tension. And it was brought up on one of the earlier panels. It is a real tension when the FDA comes out with a label that is broader than it seems the patient cohorts were in the clinical trials. It creates real questions for everybody about how to manage that distinction. But the usual practice for payers is not just to take the FDA label and don't ask any questions, but to look deeper. And that's part of what any review of the evidence will do, is to go down and to say, where is the evidence stronger? Even if it's okay for the entire label, is it stronger for certain kinds of patients? And do we get different value out of treating different levels of severity, for instance? So it raises real difficult questions. Yeah, Kim.
I appreciate the examples that Pat just gave, and I think it's going to open the door, at least I'm thinking in the Medicaid space, and I'm sure in commercial space too, for the one-time example you gave, $7 million case. What happens if we give that and we pay for it and it doesn't work because they had some undiagnosed small condition, their pulmonary system that made it. So I think it's going to open doors about having payers speak with the manufacturers a little more closely on agreed parameters and almost bring them into the discussion about who are we going to approve jointly, because if that doesn't work, you're going to have to reimburse us,
right.
Like if that, something like that.
Right, and there's no way to do a good job of distinguishing a lot of the conversation today from when the assessment is done, how it's linked to a payment mechanism and tracking of outcomes through time. Because as we have greater uncertainty heading into the early decisions, we all recognize that we need better data and evidence going forward from there. And how do we wrap, we are at the early days of figuring out how do we wrap systems for reevaluating the evidence, reassessing what the price should be, and kind of considering what the coverage should be as part of that process going forward. It's not like it hasn't happened all through time, as insurers don't just make a decision and go away, but it's going to increase the intensity of the focus on this question as really high-priced drugs with a lot of uncertainty come through. It's going to kind of magnify that. All right, I want to ask one other concrete question before we shift gears again towards the end. So imagine an ICER report on an ultra-rare condition. I'll let you decide what that means. And we have our cost-effectiveness results, $50,000, $100,000, $150,000 per quality. Should we go north of that and just give other data points to help inform discussion? Should we not do that? Should we go north and say, we are considering, you can think of this what you may, but other countries have sometimes used thresholds that are 2 to 3 times higher for some treatments. I can think of one, so it's not really a lot, but what kind of context would you like us to give around the cost-effectiveness results for an ultra-rare condition when we provide the results in our report and lead a discussion in public? Alan, you look distinctly uncomfortable, so tell me what you're thinking. I hope it's not the food.
It's not. I'm puzzled. I mean, if you just produce what the cost per quality is, then people can figure out what they think is a reasonable threshold. I don't think you need to go north or south. I'd set a single threshold, actually, whatever, 50, 100,000, and just say, but here's the cost per quality. And if you want to do 2 times that or 3 times that, at a cost per quality of 200,000, that can be easily figured.
Any other thoughts on that, John?
That works for me too. And to add, if you include the contextual factors that we've talked about, as I say, it's really helpful for those of us with limited budgets if you can do the research to find out what's actually important to patients and then let us figure out how we're going to factor that in. Right. But I don't see a way of getting a consensus as to what a higher threshold would be. And actually, given the current attention on the current abuses of the Orphan Drug Act and what it's created, I'm not sure that I would like to be justifying that right now. But we need it. We need somehow to get the public debate forwarded. I just see if the disconnect frustrates me. And my counterpart from the State Health Care Authority isn't here to speak for herself, but she gets told essentially what she has to cover. And whereas if she were managing the state motor pool, she would probably lose her job if she did not contract for the lowest price pickup truck she could get. And I don't care if it doesn't have the seats that you like and it doesn't have that stereo system just perfect the way you want it, but it's a truck and it does the job. Somehow people don't make the connection that there's something similar in healthcare. In extreme cases, actually, people are told that they're bad because they don't absolutely cover every flavor of everything. So all of that figures in, and especially if we get competition in these areas, then hopefully there will be some ability. Frankly, so far, the hepatitis C drugs was a hopeful case, but those were special circumstances. If you look at what's happened with pricing of PCSK9s, on the other hand, I'm not seeing it. They seem to be in lockstep.
All right, thanks. Alan, why do I call you Alan? Michael.
Yeah, so similarly, give us a number. The idea of having various quality thresholds and isn't necessary for the simple reason in this country we don't have a process by which the answer leads to coverage or non-coverage policy. So let us have it. It gives us an idea contextually for how expensive it is, because we do compare across therapeutic areas. And the other thing is, if there is information, I don't know that it helps us make a decision, but again, in terms of contextual factors, it is helpful to know how they're priced in other countries as in terms of apples to apples, whether it's by qualities or whatever. That's helpful to understand.
That can be difficult territory to giving context, but to put that in context can be difficult because often what you get out of even trying to benchmark internationally is only a piece of the picture. So
I appreciate that.
You know that, but it's just it can be tricky. Okay. Any last comments from the panel?
So as a follow-up to the question you were just asking, Steve, I mean, I think what's been great as far as in working with ICER has been the iterative steps to kind of say where are the next steps and how do we progress. And I think in February you came out with your latest, here are proposals as far as how we want to go ahead and look at this value assessment. I'll say a lot of what you had in there is exactly what I think is relevant towards this disease area for the rare diseases. So it is truly, as what we're hearing right now, it's provide us the information, provide us the ratios, provide us other ratios. So it's not just cost per quality, but it's cost per whatever is relevant.
Right.
And it's at the same time, as Lisa had brought up, really that focus on the MCDA approach, where it says, look, there's additional other things, and it's how do we systematically put that in, and how do we convey that? Because again, what's coming by is it's not what is it's not the answer. What it truly is about how do we have that conversation that needs to continue.
Thank you. Any other last comments? Oh, please, go ahead.
Again, to the
Can you grab the microphone?
Why not the MCDA? So it's transparent, you have all the criteria, you have the contextual factor, you could show the weight, you could add cost effectiveness, you could even integrate patient verbatim terms for each area. So why not explore MCDA as an approach for evaluation?
So I think it's a good question. I'll invite you to our MCDA recovery group that's held every Thursday night. We all have psychological scars to show from our attempts to do MCDA. There are some conceptual concerns about it as a formal approach. You heard some of that. And there are some practical issues about how it can be applied. So that's one of the reasons that you don't see it used routinely by the leading HTA groups. But it's always a part of a conversation. And I will suggest that we actually suggested an MCDA light approach in our methods. And the general public comment was it's not validated consensus-based. And there is no validated consensus-based MCDA approach. So people are kind of looking for how to move forward. And we're going to actually propose a way that we will at ICER work with that kind of methodology going forward to learn from it. But I don't think we're ready yet to say that we know how to exactly weight each of these other benefits, each of these contextual considerations in a way that would shift our cost effectiveness threshold or something that specific.
One other methodological discussion that was earlier, you mentioned qualitative research. So you had patient testimonials. We heard patient testimonials.
Right.
Clinical trials are in rare disease are extremely small in sample size. You could potentially have an exit interview of every trial participant with a very structured qualitative interview that could be part of the evidence package. And it could be analyzed systematically in a qualitative way and could be part of that. So how you want to integrate qualitative, moving from just a couple of testimonials to something that is more systematic in the evaluation of other factors.
And if for those of you, I hope you all understood that point, because it's something we do think a lot about, which is how do we take the general momentum and interest in patient-reported outcomes, how do we kind of ramp that up and bring it in a systematic way? Because I think there are some high expectations for what that could do that may need to be modulated a bit, but it definitely needs to be part of this process going forward, especially after launch, and that it's all part of the continuum as we go forward.
Stephen,
All right,
could I just make one final?
Yes, please.
I had a thought from this morning. You had your Chevron slide.
Yes, I'm going back to it. Would you like to see it again?
And I'll help T to that section, because you had this piece, which is the clinical economic, then we follow it with the contextual and the other, and then there's the financial and the negotiation. And I think there is perhaps a learning there from Europe, because that's kind of a similar flow to many processes we see there. And the part that really came through to me today, specific to orphan, is this other and contextual. But I can tell you, and I think you know this, once you get done with the clinical and economic, often the numeric and the quantitative aspects, we throw on the others, but they just get de-emphasized at that point when they're much more qualitative versus the other. And I think there's perhaps a learning there of reorienting the process. I mean, the meeting today has been fantastic because it's focused and had a very strong emphasis on how do we use the evidence in support of the framework.
Right.
If you started with the clinical evidence and the safety evidence, then went to this contextual and other considerations, before then you went to the budget impact, and then ultimately to the cost effectiveness, those other considerations likely might inform how you would go about and pursue the cost effectiveness. And the other piece I'll just add is, since Biogen sent me here from Europe, and there's been a lot of comments today about that have been directed towards industry, and I think the industry's kind of represented themselves. I just want to say that we come here very much towards a goal, which is very common, which is an open, comprehensive, and transparent value framework, which we all need. And in lack of a way to really qualify the level of evidence, you can lump everything together and it just doesn't seem appropriate. And so the way that we look at this is we need a way to discriminate, and so things can be done in the most efficient way. And that's why it's a real pleasure to be here and part of the discussion, because I think it's crucial on the iterative steps that we take going forward.
Oh, thank you. And I know that sounds like a final statement that you could all use before you go home, but we've got another short session. I would like to thank the panelists, though, very much for their participation. All right, you guys get to sit down. All right, let's take 1 minute as they get down, just to kind of shift gears, and you will see, as I'm going to talk about that chevron again. Oh, there it is, that number. Where's the chevron? There it is. I've often thought that Microsoft has a power that we don't often acknowledge, which is every conceptual idea we have has to be projected in one of their templates. So many times they are sequential and you can't really describe it. And in relation to your last comment, what we do when we start an evidence review is actually we talk to patients and to clinical experts to get this stuff down before we even start to read the clinical literature. Because we have to learn the richness of the diversity of different patients, how they view kind of not just this, but we talk to them about clinical outcomes. But we really do have to start with that as kind of a framing element. So I know that in most diagrams, the clinical and the economic piece may come first, but in a conceptual way, in some ways, we start with the other to make sure that it colors and helps us orient ourselves around this information. So if you remember this diagram, and what we're going to do is going to spend about 45 minutes with your final guidance and comments, with the idea being, let me just go through all of these. So this has been, first of all, from our selfish perspective at ICER, this has been an incredibly helpful conversation in terms of hearing the different thoughts about the tensions, about some of the opportunities. And again, we've heard some specific kind of ideas for how we would or would not do some things. But I just want to highlight again that there's a spectrum of time and actor here to consider. So you've heard some of the conversations around whether ICER should or should not change its approach to judging the strength of evidence and, if you will, the economic thresholds for value in looking at rare and ultra-rare conditions. Should we adjust our standards for strength of evidence? Should we adjust our standards for cost effectiveness in an explicit, transparent, and regular way for some subset of orphan conditions, I'll say? We don't have to do that. We could do that. What do we think we should do with our independent counsels? They haven't been part of this conversation today. They live in their lives as clinicians, as methodologists, as kind of patient and public representatives. And there are 15 to 18 of them. They're not representative of the United States. They do represent a diverse set of perspectives. Do we ask them something different when they're looking at an ultra-rare or rare condition? Do we guide them? Do we just, in a sense, get their descriptive take on how to weigh some of these other benefits and things? And again, remember that some people would argue that the job of this group, in a sense, is to remain as objective and value-free as possible so that there can be an evidence-based tool for innovators and payers to use in which they would, oh, for heaven's sakes, in which they would weigh in these questions. So it's not just do we adjust standards for strength of evidence, but it's who does it, when, who thinks about priorities for rarity, we, they, and how do we kind of make specific statements? Because at some point, in a couple months, we are going to want to put out a statement on how we are going to look at our methods in approaching ultra-orphan, I'll say, drugs. And we're going to want to try to be as explicit as possible about the justification and the thinking behind it. So going back, and I'm going to try to split maybe the conversation into 3 or 4 chunks, going all the way back to the beginning, if you will, to contextual considerations and ethical considerations. I'd love to hear your final thoughts on whether there is a strong argument, a justifiable argument for changing the methods of assessment for ultra-rare conditions. Is it an ethical reason that we would do it? Is it a practical reason we would do it? Or is the ethics that we don't do it because to do so is to tilt the table in the wrong direction implicitly? So let's start with that, and then we'll move into the kind of how we deal with the clinical evidence and how we talk about strength of evidence for ultra-rare conditions. So does anybody want to try to state again if you were giving us, whispering in our ear, your guidance for how we would think about whether we should even begin to change our approach for ultra-rare, what would your advice be? Anybody left over with that original vote who said you shouldn't change anything you do for ultra-rare conditions?
Hi, Carol Forster from Mid-Atlantic Permanente. No, I didn't change my mind. Sorry, but
no, it's fine.
I still think that we really respect and trust your work in ICER, and we use it frequently, and I do not want to see you change your approach. I think an ultra-rare or rare condition, when it is affecting a child and that decreases the length of that child's life, is to the physician and to the patient's family not really different when if it was a condition that was affecting many more patients but still had the same outcomes. And as a pediatrician, I can tell you I've seen, unfortunately, many children who had terminal illnesses that were not always rare. but did affect the family significantly, kept the parents up 24/7, taking care of the child until they did die. And I don't see anything different in that space than if that was a rare condition. And I think the way you evaluate the treatment and whether or not it has evidence basis and whether or not it is cost effective should be the same, whether it's rare or not. Now, I do understand the economics, and I think that's where the differences come in. And I think pharma has tried to explain how they rationalize $750,000 a year for a patient's care. But that's the difference, I think, is the cost issues. I don't think it's really that different as far as evaluating a treatment.
Thank you. I want to get into to the clinical and the economic pieces. I can't keep them completely separate, obviously, but is there a way that if we go all the way back again to the ethical piece, for those of you who want to argue for a difference in approach, is there a way to refine our justification about when we do and when we don't feel like that's necessary in an assessment? Again, we could go back and talk about pure number levels, but I think, again, for some of us that leads it more into a practical issue, is that we want to treat them differently if they're too small, because we know that they can't do clinical trials the same way and they can't do the same kind of cost return on investment as a larger population. So we're going to change things because of those practical realities. But is there again, we've heard a little bit about whether children's illnesses, severe illnesses, the way that affects families, communities, is somewhat different perhaps. Again, we don't have folks here from the cancer community, but when they hear ultra-orphan, they hear orphan. That's right, David, thank you. Looking younger every day, but you're not a child. So in general, though, they would, maybe we should have thought of this, but when they consider this, they obviously don't want to get left out of the considerations of the breadth of the impact of treatment on families, for their condition as well, much as David has mentioned. Anyway, is there anything that people would want to suggest as a way for us to look at refining the population where we would want to consider doing something different if we are? Does anybody want a number used as a threshold for us? We're probably going to have to pick one. To be transparent, to be fair, we're going to have to tell people the rules of the game. If the prevalent population is above 10,000, is we do it one way, and if it's below 10,000, and maybe a couple of other criteria, we do it differently. Because that's what they do in all kind of European systems. They have to try to make it clear, and sometimes there's a fight. I've been aware of some fights where patient populations, even patient advocacy groups, will sometimes be advocating that we're important, we need funding because we're more patients than you think we are. And then when they get into the HTA world, they actually want to be fewer patients because they get, in a sense, a different track of consideration. Nord, do you want us to split orphan diseases and to say we're going to do a different assessment for ultra-orphan at less than 10,000 patients in the US?
So we have considered splitting up the rare disease population into subpopulations, whether it be ultra-orphans or other terminologies for other policy-making reasons, whether it be within incentives, whether it would be within FDA review, perhaps other areas. And each time we've considered these options, we've found that it's much more likely that we would do harm to the populations that wouldn't be considered ultra-orphan in this case, so the rares but not ultra-rares, than we would be doing in helping the individuals in the ultra-rare. And so for that reason, we have always discouraged policymakers and others from subdividing the rare population into subsets because we believe that there could be more harm than good that would come of that. And for that matter, I don't see why that wouldn't necessarily apply in this case if it's not done incredibly carefully, in that the review of therapies for patient populations between, let's say, 10,000 and 200,000 would very possibly be disadvantaged because of the prioritization or preferencing of individuals of 10,000 patient population or fewer. So for that reason, we've discouraged such subdivision in any other context.
All right. Well, first of all, we are always very careful in what we do, so we're going to do it carefully. But I'm not sure I understand how if we have a usual approach that we would currently use throughout most of that spectrum, and some people would view that we're doing something different, maybe more generous or lenient for a small group. How are we, I guess, unless you think that that's going to take something away from the folks above that threshold, which I don't, I mean, you're right though, every time someone feels like there's a spectrum of the patient population that's getting a different standards, then somebody feels like they didn't get it and so they're indirectly losing out. Is that what you're kind of talking about?
In a sense, or there could be the attitude that a patient population of 12,000 individuals is no different than a patient population of 3 million of a common disease, if we're giving extra attention to those who are in a subpopulation of the rare disease population. And
I wonder if, see, one of the things we could do is come up with criteria saying it's a number and there are reasons that the evidence being brought forward would be expected not to meet usual criteria for certainty in some way. I mean, there might be real reasons that something, you know, a condition just could not be randomized or could not be blinded, or you couldn't have long-term follow-up, or you had to use a surrogate outcome, some combination of those, and a lot of rarity in order, because, again, to me, part of this thinking about what's fair is to say if we're going to do something different, it's on the basis of something that we all would, I guess, agree to, but that's never going to happen. But at least I could point to those practical issues as a way of creating criteria within the orphan conditions that I think I could stand behind. Harold?
So, yeah, so is this Harold Carter from Express? So I think just looking at it in reading through some of the pre-work, but then also during this discussion, it still doesn't sound like, it sounds like other countries have done this right, but with limited success, if at all, around differentiating sort of rarity and what that means. So is it really just from the adjusting your standards to say, hey, there's other things that we should be taking into account outside of just, you know, what the studies say? So what we heard from others, like Beth and others that were up there around the, is that more the question, or is it more of a, do we adjust our quality, up quality sort of range to give some variability?
Yeah,
there?
again, it's hard to keep these things all separate, I agree.
Sorry.
It was more, I guess I was bleeding into the question of, if we're going to do something different, what's the best way to identify the I'm going to say subpopulation, because I know my bias is that when we have looked at patient populations for conditions that are north of 100,000, I just don't sense that there's a great difficulty in doing the kinds of clinical trials or getting the clinical outcomes, and even on the pricing and value side, I just don't sense that there's a reason that the usual mechanics of value assessment break down until you get pretty small. And there are very specific reasons that even at a small number you couldn't get at least the evidence. I mean, you could say that there's still an issue around the return on with the price in a small patient population, but at least to me, I guess I'm focusing more on the clinical evidence difficulties as one reason to suggest that we would identify them as ultra rare. And you know, what's hard is that we heard a lot of people who said, don't do this. ICER, don't adjust your standards, because that helps us. I forget who said this most clearly, but let us see your standards across all different treatments and other kinds of healthcare interventions. Don't bend to the wind too much, because we want to be able to see it apples to apples, and we will consider any differences at a later time. Jim?
So I may be missing something here because I'm not really in the HTA world, but it's hard for me to see why ICER would want to make those adjustments at point 1. It seems to me that the apples to apples comparison and the provision of an analysis with a consistent terminology is useful for the users. And it's at the next 2 points that the adjustments seem to come in more naturally. integration of other benefits, and then in the final negotiation. But I haven't heard for me, a persuasive argument for introducing adjusted standards at the point of the original ICER report.
Yeah, and maybe some of this, I'll try to give a brief statement on that, or justification for the consideration of doing it. And part of it is just the words that we use. Adjusting standards feels like you're finagling something, whereas if I said nuanced approach to uncertainty or something, it might sound different to different people's ears. I'll give you an example from outside the orphan drug area. When we look at devices, implantable devices, for instance, evidence reviewers are, if you're asked that same basic question of what do you think of the balance of benefits and risks to this new device? And let's say the data you've got on an implantable device in the spine is 6 months of a study. Now, some people would say that I'm going to rate that evidence as extremely low quality and gives me no certainty because I need 10 years of data before I'll really know how that implant holds up. Because I know that a lot of things start to break down years 7 to 10. So until I've got that data, I'm going to say that the evidence is inadequate to judge that it's clinically better than usual care. Other reviewers would say, I know that we will never get a 10-year study, not for another 10 years at least. And I'm not willing to say that the evidence on any spinal implant is therefore going to be inadequate to say that it's better than usual care unless we have 10 years worth of data. So in a way, they're modulating their thinking about uncertainty based on the reality of the evidence that they have and are likely to get. So similarly, there is a subtle but real challenge when we're looking at an evidence base for an ultra-rare condition where we might know that we would usually want to see 10,000 patients double-blind randomized for 5 years, whatever. We know we'll never get that here. And so do we end up saying that basically every ultra-orphan drug that comes through with a single-arm trial has inadequate evidence to judge its comparative clinical effectiveness? I don't think we help. I don't think you could say that that's being fair and equal across different kinds of treatments, but our reports and the syntheses we make and even the judgments around the clinical evidence have a lot of weight going forward, and it's not like they are sometimes strongly reassessed by later decision makers in that way. So part of me feels like we should be sensitive to some of the nuances of what evidence is possible to get as a part of how we're judging the evidence without blurring it too much, because we do want to highlight the uncertainties. But in terms of trying to send a message about adequacy of a body of evidence to make clinical and policy decisions, I feel motivated to consider some slightly different approaches at some level of rarity and other considerations that mean that we just can't get the kinds of evidence, if you will, that we would want to see.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Stephen, I think it's spot on this, because I just took a look. I was pulling back up your evidence matrix framework. And to me, for orphan, it would have to be fit for purpose. And if I just look at what we would consider high under that framework.
Well, we never get high certainty on anything.
Well, and Michael described this as being one of the value pieces that he uses. So to me, that's like one of the most important areas. And the report actually did a very nice job, even in the rare space, of trying to outline differences where there was a few patients in open label versus sham-controlled trials with over hundreds of patients. So there's a wide variation. But if I look at the criteria that exists now, it's to get high quality, larger studies conducted in representative patient populations, direct comparisons available, address important outcomes or validated surrogate outcomes, long-term data on benefit risk available, consistent results, future studies unlikely to change. These are all, as we talked about earlier, these are the fundamental complex uncertainties that come with the evidence that comes with rare conditions. So to me, then we would be saying there's no possibility for a rare to ever have high. So that's why I just think there needs to be a remoderation of these.
And partly I do view one of the things we can add is within the sea of types of evidence that we will get for ultra-orphan conditions, there will be better evidence for some than others. It's not like we can't still identify evidence that's pretty fishy, if you will, for a variety of reasons. But my guess is that we can use our own nuance, and I guess it would be linked to adjusting standards, to within what we view as quote unquote reasonable or possible, whether it's a good package of evidence on which to make policy decisions. So I know it sounds a little murky perhaps, but I think we can do it. I think unconsciously we probably do anyway to a certain extent, but we want to try to be as explicit as possible. Are we going to be, in a sense, using a different metric of judgment? Can we make that transparent enough to work? Although I still am pulled back to the hopes that if we keep our standards high enough, we will bring people up to it, because it's patients and it's clinicians, not just payers. It's everybody who really will benefit if we can get better evidence. So in a sense, I want to have it both ways. I want to be able to be sensitive and nuanced, but I want to still have a standard that calls people to bring and to develop better data going forward so that we can make better judgments even at or near the time of launch.
I would
Yes.
say not adjusting the standard, but contextualizing the evidence in terms of the heterogeneity, also not just the numbers. So it could be small number size, but also the heterogeneity of the disease condition, the lack of validated endpoints. So this evidence package, and here's the context around this. So this is the best that you could get given that, or there is better. And so it's not just driven by the number, but all other factors in the disease area.
That's what I'm trying. I think we'll need to find a way to describe that. Do the payer? Let me let you comment. I'm sorry, you've been patient. Thank you.
So, as a recovering...
Could you introduce yourself?
Yes, Tatia Woodward, GSK. And as a recovering modeler, what I'm struck by in looking at ultra-orphan...
That's on Friday nights, the recovering models.
What I'm struck by is the package of evidence, and I think a number of people alluded to that. It's the uncertainty, not only at the time of the evaluation, but as it evolves, because we don't have that information. One of the things that I think hasn't been brought up is, not to expand the ICER's remit, but looking at the value of information, and should you change your actual decision-making or your interpretation based on the missing information. There's a formal paradigm to incorporate value of information analysis, as well as your willingness to change your decision-making on that point. So just something for the team to consider.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
That's a really good comment and sort of related.
Sorry, can you
to that.
introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm Abby Bronson from PPMD. And you were discussing or considering whether ICER should...
You pull it a little closer? Sorry.
You were discussing whether ICER should bring in, do an apples-to-apples comparison and then let the individual payers sort of add the contextual effects as they wish. The only thing to consider in that model is that it leaves patients very confused with sort of an unequal playing field when one payer does one thing and another payer does another. So it's just something to add into the mix as you consider your path forward.
That's an issue we are unlikely to solve as far as that is, in terms of a given in the United States, at least for the time being, with multiple payers, there will be multiple reasons why they may look at the same body of evidence and come up with a different judgment. And we do hope, our work from day one at ICER has been to hope that we can bring a greater transparency and calibration, if you will, at least around the way that different elements of evidence and values are brought into the decision making. So to that extent, and to the extent that we can involve other stakeholders in that discussion, I hope we will reach a little bit more calibration over time. I was curious, the payers, as you've heard me say a little bit more about how we might want to at least kind of, I'll say nuance here instead of adjust. Does it make sense to you as long as we make it transparent enough what we're doing and how? I'm not really suggesting that, well, anyway, let me just leave it there. Do you have any thoughts, yes, Alan?
As you said earlier, I know you'll be careful when you do that. Right. The comment is, I think we all recognize that there are differences in the types of studies that can be undertaken for ultra-rare diseases or even sometimes rare diseases, and therefore the types of evidence that can be brought forward. I think what has to be contextualized, and you've talked about it, is you know, is it a parachute effect where you have a very dramatic, significant outcome, or is it a effect that, you know, jumping from 5-foot wall versus a 6-foot wall, you know, you might get, you know, a tiny bit of incremental benefit, but not great wearing a parachute. You know, and so it's going to be this question of how significant, and you're just going to have to figure and be somewhat transparent in how you're adjusting it. But it's not just about it being a rare disease, but it's about the significance of the outcome and the dramatic. Is it quantum or Newtonian in its impact? Because if it's Newtonian and small incremental, and the quality of the studies are poor, you know, the comparators are poor. I don't want to point to anyone around this room, but I can give multiple examples of that in the literature in these situations. And then you're saying, but oh, it's a rare disease, so we're going to accept it. That doesn't make sense to me. It's got to be contextualized more broadly.
I'm going to shift to talk about cost effectiveness, pricing, and other things, and other benefits too. But if there's further comments, Kim?
Yeah, real quick.
Yeah.
I think because I was on the fence and I was saying that I probably would lean to not changing it. I think I would agree. I'm sorry I didn't catch your name, but the pediatrician who spoke in the back from Kaiser, you know, I would agree with her. I wouldn't change the quality per se or the cost effectiveness part of it, because I think there are plenty of other diseases, and my heart goes out to all of them, but there's a lot of family care burden on a lot of other diseases, 24-hour care. So I think that that's still appropriate, where I think that you could make some adjustments to your model that I think would be helpful from a payer's perspective, is to set the bar and the standard for the strength of evidence. So for instance, if you take like Kalydeco and cystic fibrosis, you know, a trial with 50 patients, that may be as best as I'm going to get. So you may want to signal to payers like, this is strong. Despite you thinking that a N of 50 is not good, we're telling you this is good. So I think that could be very helpful to us.
Got it. And it's that kind of nuance and carefulness and transparency that I would definitely shoot for, because otherwise the last thing we want is for our approach or what's in our heads to be changed without people really kind of understanding what and why. Did you have a comment? Yes.
So I just find it a little challenging, and this is a real-world example where I think the FDA looked at a rare disease clinical trial, and because they enrolled a lot of patients, they thought this was a good clinical trial. For people in DMD who actually know that it is a heterogeneous patient population, that clinical trial actually didn't make sense because they enrolled younger patients and older patients, and you were never actually going to see whether the drug worked or not. You weren't going to see a difference. And so it's a little frightening for people to start weighing in on clinical trials without the expertise of actually knowing the disease, because that could lead to wrong conclusions and then wrong recommendations. And this is inherently tied to access. You know, as much as we want to separate it or not, right? You're going to be making decisions that, you know, I don't know if you have the appropriate context or not, that are going to impact the payers, which are then going to actually impact the patients. And so that's a real consideration that I think people need to.
And that's a responsibility we take very, very seriously. So that's why, as I mentioned, before we start our clinical assessment, before we start to read the literature, we reach out to the manufacturers, to the patient organizations, and to clinical experts. And we spend a furious time doing that at the beginning so that we can get ourselves grounded. Because I know how easy it is to count beans and to do p-values and to really not get it. We all know how possible that is. So if we're going to do a good job of what Kim said, but across all of our work, we have to make sure that we in a sense, are grounded and we know some of the details about the key studies, because they're really critical. All right, so this is really helpful. Let's shift then to talking about the other benefits and contextual considerations to a certain extent. I thought we had a really good discussion about that in terms of how critical it is to understanding all interventions, but how there are, again, magnification around some of these and some important nuance about the way it extends, for instance, between caregiver to family and even beyond for some rare conditions. I'm not sure that, again, it's always going to be that clear that it's because it's rare that there's a specific other benefit. But I think there's a lot of important nuance within the list of other benefits we had. And again, our approach has been to, again, get that information from patients and patient groups, from talking to the manufacturers, clinical experts. We start to generate lists ourselves in our heads of how this works. And we are, as John Watkins pointed out, we are, in a sense, beefing up our inclusion of descriptions of those in our reports. At our meetings, we also encourage our panel members to hear further testimony on them and then to consider them and to discuss them. And I think, again, for us, the learning today, I'd be interested in your reflections, is A, this is really important. It's helpful to have an explicit list. It's always important to be open to new other benefits that might be very specific to that particular situation. And that there will be an ongoing worldwide struggle in figuring out how to make those real and tangible and yet not swamp the entire process of looking at evidence as well. And part of that is tension over when and how you would quantify their inclusion in the cost per quality analysis in some way, because there are some ways that, you maybe remember some of the techniques, none of them are widely kind of accepted as a consensus approach. And so right now what we've decided to do is, again, to try to keep them as explicit and clear, and to then learn about whether maybe in the world's HTA groups we will, again, start to be one of the first to try to figure out how to bring them in quantitatively over time. But to do so now would probably have a high risk of unintended consequences, I guess is the way I'd put it. Any other thoughts about the other benefits? Contextual, how it's made part of value assessment? Here, I'll say again, we at ICER feel like this is not surprisingly, but importantly critical to the way that our reports are read by others. So you heard from some payers that this is a part that they really do capture, because not all of them have the ability to do kind of extensive outreach and discussions with a variety of different folks. So we feel it's an important part of what we are trying to do. And we obviously really rely on the engagement with the patient groups and the manufacturers and clinical experts to do a decent job of that. Did you have a question? Yeah, all right, Harold.
So I, just out of curiosity, so once we kind of put this into the framework for ICER, is there I guess, have you thought through, is there a way for this to evolve or to get feedback on how to improve it? Because I'm sure there'll be wrinkles in the first one or two goes of this.
Soon to come, as many people have heard me say for too long, will be our kind of revised update kind of guidance for how we're going to do things for the next couple of years. And actually, it's been delayed just because we got such thoughtful public comment, and we have been working on different iterations. But the long story short is that we are going to have a way to work with all the different stakeholders and to get input as we learn about different ways to capture these other benefits and to weave them in to what we do. But I think there was, again, as I mentioned, there was a fair amount of public comment in our discussions with a lot of people. Just the risk that if we marched ahead too quickly into quantifying and integrating, that it might not kind of, in a sense, be the best for everybody. So we're going to work on that and learn. But the bioethicist in me, and Jim next to me here would agree, you can talk about quantifying, you can talk about weighing. There are always going to be important elements of a decision that you need to integrate in without being able to quantify or weigh them in a mathematical format. So that's always one of the tensions. If you create a mathematical approach and you pretend like there's nothing else in there, you kind of, you run a risk. So we're going to try to work together and figure out how to do this well. And we'll be in touch with other HTA groups internationally, because again, this is one of those areas where people try different experiments, and the Norwegians have just decided to launch off and do a new approach to it, so we'll be learning from their experience. But it is something that we will clearly identify as super important when we're talking about many ultra-rare conditions, because the other benefits outside the clinical data are going to be very important, very important. Yes?
Yeah, hi, Donald Hahn for Pfizer. So I guess the discussion earlier this afternoon talked about fairness, and it came through clearly that rarity by itself is not sufficient to justify any kind of special privileges. And that's consistent with what's in the public domain in terms of surveys that have done, societal surveys that have been done with many developed markets. But what did come through consistently in some of the survey work was that not so much rarity separated itself, but what came through clearly in terms of separation was diseases of high severity and with high unmet need, and where interventions had an impact on the caregiver burden. So whether how that gets contextualized in this context, I think is something worthy of consideration.
Yeah. The severity, just again, if you, for those of you who know the methodology of what to do with severity and cost effectiveness, it runs the gamut from doing nothing special and assuming that people will, because what we're talking about is if you get a certain amount of health gain for someone who's really, really sick, and you get the same amount of health gain, be it quality of life or length of life, for someone who's up at the higher end of health to begin with, those could be exactly the same numerically. But many people would feel like, well, certainly if I had to choose between doing this or this, I would do this. There's an instinct to preferentially go for this most severe condition. So some people believe that that is adequately captured in the cost per quality in many ways, because especially if it's a pediatric condition, you're going to get that gain and it will be a long time. But in general, there's still the possibility that severity won't be as clearly seen, if you will, as a part of the decision making. And yet there have been many different approaches. We are going to list it as one of the contextual considerations. We didn't give that list to you. We have a list of 6 contextual considerations as well. Uncertainty, but severity is one of them. So we are going to identify that as an explicit component that we want the council to consider in its deliberations. All right, so let's move to cost effectiveness and budget impact and pricing. So, okay, most concretely, ICER puts out a value-based price benchmark for each assessment linked to the cost per quality at 100 to 150,000. That range has been there to send a signal that there is no single bright line. We have these other benefits to consider as part of modulating, if you will, between that if you want to. Obviously, payers and others might feel that even that 100 to 150, maybe they want to go lower. Where's Pat Gleason? Lower. Could be higher. So what do we do for ultra-rare conditions? Do we do the same thing and say a value-based price at 100 to 150,000 is X, and there are all these other contextual issues about this being an ultra-rare condition? Do we not suggest a value-based price for an ultra-rare drug at all? I will say that there's been tremendous general interest in ICER continuing to produce the beginning of a conversation by generating a value-based price benchmark. But let me just throw it out to you all. How do you think we should address that specific question of using cost effectiveness as a part of value assessment, specifically with flipping it on its head to come up with a value-based price? Harold?
This is on. I think you still definitely want the price that you put out. I think fundamentally that's what folks look at today, Express Scripts, others look at today as sort of a starting point in understanding where things are falling out. I think from there could probably be just, thinking out loud here is there could be, here's some contextual issues that we would consider based on, the disease state, its severity, that could have some additional impact, and you show what that impact maybe is financially. But I still think that there is a financial number that you put out in the marketplace as you do today. So I wouldn't change that. Now, some of my pharma buddies may not agree with that, but I don't think you remove that.
So I want to also highlight as one of the questions, we've been more careful with our language over time to distinguish between a value-based price linked to long-term cost effectiveness and any kind of consideration around shorter-term budget impact. As you heard internationally, many of them almost kind of move budget impact into a preferential layer of consideration before they think about cost effectiveness, or at least in conjunction with it. So is there something different we should do with potential budget impact? Should we make it a more prominent part of talking about it? Because, again, some people might say, well, you know, the cost effectiveness doesn't look great, at least at the list price or the net price that we estimate. We can do the value-based price benchmark at 100, 150. But look, the potential budget impact, it's an ultra-orphan condition. It's going to be relatively small. Is that part of an important package, or should we work hard to keep budget impact away from the cost effectiveness piece of this? Some of you in the pharmaceutical land will be familiar with this argument. So,
Stephen, I had a thought on that, because and it kind of goes to some of my other comments today on the modeling and some of the challenges that we've seen in Europe where they have moved a little bit away. And it gets to, you end up with a number, but that doesn't speak to all of the assumptions and the things that went into that, which are extremely variable when you're working with a limited data set. And so one idea for the cost effectiveness, it could have a very important role at the back end, but it would be, what we found the model is useful is it helps frame uncertainty. And I think earlier to how it was being used where, as a tool to begin discussions on managed entry agreements, to me that would be a useful piece to come out of the framework, which is here's certain areas that have greater uncertainty than others. And so those should be areas potentially targeted for, you know, partnerships or solutions between a payer and a manufacturer to address those until there's more evidence to eliminate or reduce that uncertainty.
Right.
That would be one way to use the model, though, to give more of a solutions orientation to provide access and try to manage through this.
So how would you have us respond to the basic request that when the next Spinraza comes out and it's $850,000, can you, ICER, help give us some context on whether that price is aligned with the benefit to patients? Because otherwise we don't have a basis for rational discussion about the pricing. We just kind of react one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's why I've been very encouraged in many ways today, because unless you have a comprehensive, transparent value framework which can capture these things, there's no construct to have that conversation. So I think that's why this is so important, what we're trying to do here. And that's why I speak to the modeling piece. To me, it's less about coming up with a threshold or a number. It's more about trying to frame for orphan space where we know there's a much different complex challenge than we have on other products.
Right.
Try to frame the uncertainty and come up with solutions or suggestions for ways to manage that uncertainty, whether it's long-term budget uncertainty, whether it's long-term population uncertainty on who will ultimately use the product.
Yeah, I think that's a useful comment. And I know that it's kind of linked to the value information suggestion you made before, which is to emphasize the use of modeling as a way to identify where we know the least and where. So it's almost always, by the way, in the experience of health economics, it's almost always going to be on our assessment of what happens 10 to 15 years later. Does the duration of, the durability of the effect continue out? Do we have no side effects out 10 to 15 years? If you make minor adjustments at 10 to 15 years and they're living the rest of their life, it almost always kind of swamps all the other assumptions that you're making in the model. So, but anyway, I think your point's very well taken. Alan, did you want to come back on that? Can you use the microphone, sir?
I'm going back to, I think,
it's
for most people on the policy, and just for consumers who may be actually looking at this, not individual consumers, but whether it's state government policymakers for Medicaid or for these, I think a single number that says this is what would be appropriate, this is the price that this would have to be, whether it's a device, a drug, for meeting a standard cost per quality, 100,000 per quality adjusted life year, 50, whatever number, but standard. And then people can take the contextual and decide from a societal, from everybody else. But to throw it out into all sorts of ways, you're not suggesting price. You're doing an economic analysis that is helpful when it stays fact-based and consistent for consumption. And throwing additional ambiguity in there just confuses the picture from my perspective.
Oh, I know. I mean, from our own experience, though, we know that if I'm sitting in the pharmaceutical company's shoes, they see the headline, whatever it's going to be negative about the pricing, not reasonable, above cost effectiveness. And the headline itself kind of drives, certainly it drives a conversation, but it drives it in a way that is obviously challenging from some stakeholders' perspectives. I just want to acknowledge that.
I acknowledge that too, but I think, going in the other direction produces just as much, pressure in other, situations. And so, I just say stay fact-based, stay consistent.
The back of the room has been remarkably quiet, is because I'm not torturing you by walking closer to you. Any comments, questions? All right. Well, I'll tell you what. As far as guiding, I've been kind of seeking guiding principles in our heads, and I know the ICER staff, all the senior staff are here today, and I'll just go back to this slide here. I think this is an overblown way to say again that we need guidance and principles that emerge from the discussions like we've had today. So we recognize that ICER is not there to come up with this on our own and to kind of impose it and let people react to it. It's a work in progress. All of our methods are, and in particular in this area where we sensed a coming pipeline of ultra-orphan drugs. You all know it's coming too. We sense that we're going to have to start to do more assessments on ultra-orphan drugs, and we wanted to start the conversation with you all as we go into that area so that we can learn and continue to figure out how to do this right, because it's a work in progress, but we know that it's of real interest to consumers, to policymakers, to employers, to payers, to manufacturers, to everybody. So we try to do it, obviously, with a certain sense of responsibility and recognition that we can do damage as well as do good by trying to make these conversations more explicit and more transparent. But we also, again, we know that no country feels like that it's got this nailed. All you have to do is go to Denmark. How they do ultra-orphan drugs is perfect. Everybody's happy. It doesn't work that way. I'd love to go to Denmark, but that's another story. So we have to figure out how to continue to work on this together. And I also remember when we started the work group months ago on this to lead up to this meeting, I kept saying one thing, which is, this meeting's really going to disappoint you. The technical brief is going to disappoint you because it's not going to answer all the questions. It's not going to come up with solutions that we can write down on our back of our envelope and implement tomorrow. But I hope it hasn't completely disappointed you. It certainly hasn't disappointed me or us. It's been that kind of coming together and willingness to talk about difficult issues that's at the heart of making good progress. And for us, it really will be a signpost of how to work going forward. So we really look forward to working with many of you going forward as we reflect and learn further about these methods and about how our experience with using them in assessments plays out. And I loved having this meeting without it being about one drug or two drugs, because then you're just too entrenched, if you will, too many people fighting for certain things. Those times will come. There will be meetings where we will be trying to do this kind of assessment, and there will be real tension and emotions about access, about innovation, the things we've been talking about, but it'll be much more, in a sense, tense and real and live around a specific set of patients. So to have the ability to talk with you in a sense in this way and to hopefully set up a groundwork for working together going forward, it's been incredibly valuable for us. So thank you for coming. Thanks to those of you who've been watching on the webinar. I'd like to acknowledge Sarah Emond, who led the working group, who led the planning for this meeting, Dan Ohlendorf and Rick Chapman, who took the lead in the background technical brief, which I think is brilliant. And I can say that because I didn't add very much content to it. It was fantastic work. And actually, I've heard that it's already circulating in other audiences that are starting to use it as a tool. So with our thanks to you again, I really appreciate your coming, and we hope to have lots further conversations with you in the future.